Greetings to viewers and listeners. Today we're going to discuss a very interesting topic, a pressing topic for both African nations as well as India, digital public infrastructure, typically understood as the triad of data, identity, and payments. And what we've seen in Africa is that there has been considerable collaboration between India, successful collaboration between India and different African nations, Ethiopia in the case of digital identification, Kenya on interoperable payment systems. And we want to understand today where African nations are when it comes to DPI and how this collaboration can be further deepened. So I have joining me today two very esteemed panelists. One is Baratang Mia. She's the founder of Girl Hype, Women Who Code, which is an organization based in South Africa. And Sylvia Mukasa, founder and CEO of Global X Investments Limited and Innovation Labs, Kenya. And I'm Meghna Bal, your moderator. I'm the director of the SIA Center. We're a tech policy-focused think tank based in New Delhi. So let's kick off with a little bit of context. Baratang, I'm going to come to you. What use cases and strategies are we seeing flourish in African nations when it comes to DPI? Because DPI has not had a typically traditional rise where it is a part of a national strategy in countries over here.
Hi, listeners. What I'm going to say is that what thrives in Africa is what solves issues and challenges of Africa. And one of the biggest challenges of Africa has 1.5 billion people at the moment, and the documentation of those people is very rare. I think 50% of African population is not documented properly. So you find that digital identification of Africans is what most governments are prioritizing. And for South Africa, we've had the most successful digital identification system because I guess we've had it for more than 20 years now, but it's just been evolving now. Anyone, from birth to death, they're documented properly. But you find that not across Africa that is happening. And then when it comes to payments, M-Pesa, with Kenya being one of the leaders, M-Pesa has been around forever. I think more than 10 years. And I could say M-Pesa was the leader in financial inclusion and setting up the tone for how digital finance would lead. And those are the big ones. And if you look at how M-Pesa operated, it was more Kenyan and then East African based, but that lacked a little bit of data exchange. Should M-Pesa have been ran across Africa, I think it would have been one of the biggest data platform when it comes to financial inclusion for Africans.
Very interesting. And we're going to come back to the example of M-Pesa and how it can be, what frameworks could be used to broaden its scope or scopes of programs that are similar to it across not only the region that Kenya is located in, but the wider continent. Sylvia, coming to you, how do you see DPI as an enabler for founders?
Hello, listeners, and thank you very much for that question. So I think it's very important that there are investments in DPI, especially for founders, especially when we look at payments, mobile payments or digital payments. We need to have platforms that founders can use, especially when establishing businesses and also when they're thinking about rolling out these services to other countries, and they need to be able to receive payments. If the infrastructure to allow for those payments is lacking, then it means rollout is limited. And these businesses cannot then receive payments from other parts of the world or other parts of different continents. So it's important that we have that infrastructure to support these mobile payments. And we've seen, we'll talk a lot about M-Pesa. And as much as M-Pesa has been a success story in Kenya, in other parts where they've tried to replicate that, it's not worked very well. And it still trickles down to infrastructure. So we need investment in that to help scale up the businesses. And then when we talk about digital identity as well, there's been a lot of fraud. When we start looking at card payments and things like that, there's a lot of fraud, and businesses struggle to then identify who are these fraudsters. So if we have platforms that can help make digital identities easy to work with by these businesses, then we'll cut down on fraud as well. So investment is very important.
Thank you. I think the problem identified by both of you is the same, and we're going to come a little bit on that and then also try to understand how those problems present an opportunity for collaboration. So interoperability seemed to be a big one for both of you. So in the context of interoperability, what are the kinds of frameworks that can be introduced to deepen this cooperation, or how can India come in, or how can India, Africa, and with African nations collaboration come in to overcome some of these challenges? Either one of you.
I'll start maybe. Africa has 54 countries. When we say Africa, we mean 54 countries with 1.5 billion people. When you say India, you mean one country. Even though it's got 1.4 billion, when you say interoperability is governed from one framework, one system, the governance is one. When you come to Africa, you've got 54 different government systems, and all independently. Even though we say AU is still an independent body of its own. So the governance and making sure that the data is interoperable has to be open from independent countries' data sovereignty. So once we've gotten that internally, the data sovereignty and governance of that country, and we understand how it's going to flow across 54 countries and how is that going to happen, it's something that the AU should prioritize at the moment, because I don't think data exchange across African countries have even begun to be discussed. And even our own data as African countries, you get from one country to the other, there isn't enough insights as a data that you cannot, some say there's no data, some they say there's enough data. How do you make sure that the framework of there's no data or there is enough data, and issues that are facing Africa, which is a language issue, how are we going to make sure that when I say there's no data and there's so much data based in our own linguistic or indigenous languages can be transferred? So before we even get to the word DPI frameworks, we need to understand our own local context as Africans. I cannot compare with what India went through because India is one country. We have to think about the local challenges of 54 countries governed totally different with different systems. Big four nations controlling the continent is not going to work.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, even within an African nations, there are many sub-nations because there are so many different tribes, and how they would respond to something coming particularly from the government would also vary.
And not only from the government, we need to understand DPI needs a lot of investment, especially infrastructure at the moment. Who's investing in Africa? And what is the cost of that investment in future? There's a talk around, are we now being colonized differently? And I personally, I have a preference. I would prefer India that has trialed and tested DPI, and they know that they are part of the global south. They know the challenges. We are all faced by the same thing: youth population, job creation. We respond. Our responses to disaster is going to be similar because we don't have enough resources. But India has tested something that can work in the global south. So when you say India, my instincts are not, my gut level is not that high. But when it starts being the people that are really investing in the infrastructure at the moment, then our gut level has to be very high, because we might end up with our own data in Africa not living in Africa, and we might end up with not knowing the insights of Africa, not even being in our hands, always dependent on investment from outside, whilst African countries could come up with their own framework and could lead the process of DPI.
Thank you for that very detailed response. And I think that I absolutely agree. Unless solutions, particularly tech solutions, are localized, there's very little chance for success, because whenever you're dealing with any kind of technological intervention, particularly when it comes to DPI, because it's so close to things that are so personal to people, identity and finance particularly, and data, which can affect every aspect of their existence. Trust is a very important consideration there, and I think you've made the case clear that South-South cooperation is better on that front than any other intervener. In that context, I want to come to you, Sylvia, and your response about the challenges and how India and different African nations can work together.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yes, I agree with what Baratang said about Africa having all these different countries. And then again, we have to go deeper. Besides having the African Union, there are again regional blocks that we have to think about. So we have SADC, we have the East African Community, we have ECOWAS, and then we have groups like Smart Africa, all this coming up with different frameworks. So it's about understanding and localizing the contexts to these different African countries and seeing what works best for them and letting them take the lead, having an Africa-led way of doing things, because then that way it becomes easier for the different African countries to look at themselves and assess themselves at what level they are at and what would work for them, rather than coming up with a one-size-fits-all kind of solution, because there's those different layers that affect these different African countries. We are different levels, and therefore I think having DPI maturity index that is very Africa-focused is very important, because then it begins to assess the different nations and what they need and meet them at the level they are at to address the gaps that need to be filled.
That's a great concept you mentioned, the DPI Maturity Index. Do you want to elaborate on that a little more, on what you mean and what parameters would be studied or evaluated in such an index?
So I think you have to look at what kind of infrastructure exists. For instance, for digital payments, what actually exists in the different countries. Look at their digital maturity levels. By digital maturity level, I am basically looking at the intensity of the digital culture and the adoption of digital technologies, because then that allows you to assess at what level are they at and how do you bring them up to speed depending on where they are at, and then also come up with a way to measure impact of whatever infrastructure you're developing and want to increase adoption around. Yeah.
And since you mentioned regional blocks, just wanted to understand, to what extent is there cooperation currently regionally on DPI between countries within different blocks? Does it exist? Is there a program towards data interoperability or any other kind of interoperability between identity systems or anything like that?
Okay, so I know at AU level, there's some frameworks around that, but across the different regional blocks, all of them are at different levels. So for instance, you'll find the East African Community gathers and has conversations around what is happening in the East African community and what the East African community wants to achieve. I'm sure there are conversations also within the SADC region and what affects them and what they need and how they would work around it. But at continental level, we have the Africa Free Trade Agreement area. And so
I think that is...
Yeah, so there's conversations around that. So, but then like we said, we have so many different layers. There's the AU level, and then there's those regional blocks. So all of them speaking at those at the block level and also at the regional level. But do they really bring these things to work together well? I don't think so. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to go around that. Yeah.
I personally think that when you think of DPI, Africa is still adopting. Most of African countries, including South Africa, they just launched it now as part of the G20, part of the digital roadmap, DPI roadmap. Now, I'm not. DPI is very confusing when you think of it as DPI, but if you think of as for what the region has been doing, and I know that the UNDP is doing a lot of work in making sure that most Africans are digitized in terms of digital identity, and there's a lot of work being done in financial inclusions at regional level, at AU level, and the UNDP is pushing a lot. And there's a lot of investors that are coming up to Africa now and saying, hey, let's get your DPI in place, which is infrastructure. Mainly, that's what they want to do, invest in infrastructure. The cost of that is also something that we need to look at it, because really, for me, it's like the cost of infrastructure coming from outside of Africa. Yes, what are the exchanges? What do you give Africa if you're going to give them such an investment? What do you expect out of it? There should be the balance of what is the cost of this. And knowledge exchange could be one of the biggest things that we share, because though Africa can sit and discuss, we still have very poor nations. We've got rural communities. We've got such sophisticated, and there's a lot of money floating around, cash, but we don't have the value, because the dollar is more expensive than the rand. So if you were to sustain an infrastructure that causes more than 200 billion, where is South Africa going to get it per year, let's say? So what I'm saying is, at the same time, we cannot lock ourselves into Africa. We need to look outside. Who's investing, and what is the cost of that investment going to be? Because we have to fast track it anyhow. We cannot have digital exclusion. We cannot be leaving people behind. It's just something that Africa cannot afford at the moment. And it is happening. And the only way we can achieve that is to get out of our silos and start working with people from outside. And India in particular.
Yeah, but as you talk about look outside, we still have to consider our own sovereignty as we are taking this investments from other sources, right? Yeah. Because for the longest time, we've had, investments by the big tech, which are digital colonizers.
They're still doing it.
As we think about that, we also need to be very careful in that whatever engagements or collaborations we get into should not be extractive. They should be mutually beneficial to the different countries and different continents. So as we look for collaboration with India, with other places, we need to consider that we co-develop, we co-invest, and we co-learn and co-create, so that we come up with solutions that are actually beneficial to both sides.
I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I always say there should be that shared risk. Africa is risking 1.4 billion people.
Yes.
And putting out 5 at the moment to the world out there and saying, hey, we are allowing you to come to our space because you're going to help us with job creation. You will help us to respond to our climate change crisis. You will help us with the youth population that's growing to be digitized, because that's what they are selling to us. Now, if there's a risk that Africa is taking, when you invest in Africa, what risk are you taking? Are you just saying, oh, I'm investing because you need the money? Or you are because there's so much we are offering the world that African leaders hasn't packaged very well to say, this is what we are offering you. In the past, it would be a gold mine, and then they will extract the gold and go do it somewhere. But at the moment, it's data, it's knowledge, it's so much that we offer to the world. It's human resources that they need to value. And once they value that, when they give, we need to, as she says, co-benefit. Yeah. There should be that shared risk for the benefits to be equal.
So we're almost out of time, but on that note, 30-second closing remarks, and particularly on what you guys just said about co-benefit. What is your vision of co-benefit, a partnership of equals, a partnership where both parties get as much out of it as they put in? 30 seconds. Whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I think what we need to do is definitely there's need for collaboration that we cannot run away from. But I think we need to start moving away from capacity building to capacity exchange, especially as we look at different collaborations, so that we are co-creating, bringing innovators, bringing the small businesses to then work together and learn from each other, and not, seeking to import DPI. We are not seeking to import, but to work together in a manner that's
a mutual platform of enablement.
And that's inclusive and brings social economic benefit as well.
Wonderful. Baratang.
I think I'd say collaboration and partnership with mutual respect between parties. And I know you said there shouldn't be capacity building. What did
Capacity
you say?
exchange.
Capacity exchange. Yeah. I think we need to capacitate our leaders in terms of African leaders understanding when they negotiate digitization, what are they negotiating? Because it's not tangible. When I talk about the internet to anybody else, they're thinking about the Wi-Fi. They're not thinking about the infrastructure, the cables, the sea cables, and all that expensive infrastructure going around. That is not what they're thinking about. And that's billions and billions of investment. Now, for me, it's when Africa says yes and sign as our leaders, digital sovereignty needs to be taken care of. They need to think about future generations. What are the legacy they're going to leave for our own Africans, especially with AI taking over the world?
Awesome. That is all we have time for today. Thank you so much for such an enriching discussion. And I think that our viewers and listeners had a lot to learn, and particularly in the context of localization, very, very important. India might be one country, but it's easy to see how it is, again, a nation of many different
regions,
states. Yeah, many different regions and states. And each state is a completely different ball game from the other one. And so there is a similarity there. And I think that kind of creates a foundation for potential collaboration, because there is this mutual understanding that there is so much diversity on the ground in both regions.
And shared experiences.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.